Ukraine uses Russian kill zone playbook. Russian troops fall for it every time. The Russian motorcycle trooper was enjoying good fortune, it seemed. Riding fast along a well-traveled track threading across the no-man's land, somewhere along the 100 km front line of Russia's wider war on Ukraine, the bike soldier maneuvered toward a gap in a deep anti-tank trench the Ukrainians had prepared for just this scenario. The flat gap, a kind of earthen bridge, was a veritable door for attacking Russian vehicles. It was, in fact, a trap, and not the first one. Ukrainian troops have sprung along the Russians' preferred routes as Russia's wider war on Ukraine grinds into its 43rd month. Incredibly, the Russian wasn't deterred by the nearby hulks of numerous destroyed armored vehicles. It's possible one alternative, trying to jump the trench, scared him more than the prospect of motoring across a possible kill zone. The tactical failures reveal a broader pattern intelligence analysts are tracking. Russian forces' inability to adapt even basic procedures despite mounting evidence of Ukrainian countermeasures. Recall what happened when, back in May, a different Russian bike soldier raced in broad daylight across the no-man's land, miraculously avoiding mines, artillery, and drones. That biker's luck held until he neared a long Ukrainian anti-tank trench, one without a convenient crossing. Apparently confident in his bike handling, the rider accelerated up the loose dirt piled up on the edge of the trench, clearly aiming to jump. He fell short and died, or was badly injured, in the resulting crash at the bottom of the trench. Apparently preferring to cross a trench rather than jump it, the Russian motorcyclist in the more recent incident rode right into the Ukrainians' trap. As a Ukrainian drone observed, the trooper sped over a mine and exploded in a towering fireball. Incredibly, the Russian survived, at least for a little while. He could be seen moving amid the wreckage of his wrecked motorcycle. Ukrainian war correspondent Yuri Butasov was bemused but not surprised. Russian Banzai suicide bombers race across the field straight into a mine with a natural result, he wrote. It is clear that they were far from the first at this location, but the Russian commanders do not care about the endless conveyor belt of the dead and maimed. Butasov's cynicism is justified. This kind of thing has happened before. In April 2024, the Ukrainian troops defending Chasiv Yar, a now ruined town in the no-man's land in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast, set a similar trap for the Russian mechanized forces pushing west across Donetsk. The trap straddled a bottleneck for Russian forces rolling out from their forward base in occupied Ivanivska. That bottleneck is a small bridge on the TO 504 road that threads west out of Ivanivska and through a forest into Chasiv Yar's southern districts. If the Russians, possibly from the 11th Air Assault Brigade, then operating from the ruins of Bakhmut, a few miles to the east, could get over the bridge, they would have been able to disappear into the woods and creep toward Chasiv Yar with some degree of concealment from drones and artillery and protection from mines. And they eventually did cross the bridge, but only after suffering shockingly heavy casualties. Local Ukrainian forces from the 42nd and 67th Mechanized Brigades and adjacent units concentrated enough firepower on the bridge to temporarily block Russian assaults on southern Chasiv Yar before they reached the protection of the trees. They knocked out vehicle after vehicle until the road was littered with scorched metal, in one instance creating a traffic jam of destroyed equipment. Ukrainian analysis group Frontelligence Insight anticipated the Russians' struggle crossing that bridge. The road connecting Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut has several bridges over the water channel, the group explained. With the right approach and correctly allocated resources, Chasiv Yar could potentially be a very formidable obstacle to advancing Russian troops. It was especially formidable given Russian commanders' inability to adapt quickly and find a safer route for their beleaguered troops. That stubbornness is still evident a year and a half later as Russians continue riding to their injury or death on that one deadly trench crossing. What's especially shocking is that the Ukrainian tactic on display on that vehicle-eating crossing is that it's straight out of the Russians' standard battlefield doctrine. According to the definitive The Russian Way of War, Russian regiments construct fortifications to, quote, protect the forward edge of the defense and canalize the enemy into fire sacks within the defense. This strategy, repeatedly used by Ukraine, funnels enemies into kill zones where they are destroyed with concentrated firepower. The fire in the fire sack could be tank fire, artillery, anti-tank missiles, or, as was the case for that unfortunate biker, mines. Previously, Ukrainian forces are closing the gap around the remaining Russian forces in their Dobropilya salient. As Ukrainians finish off pockets of Russian resistance, the Russians' only hope is to surrender to the advancing Ukrainian army or be annihilated completely. After conducting a successful penetration from the high ground in the west, Ukrainians are now launching their attacks from the north as well, completing the pincer around the Russian Dobropilya salient. Ukrainians are using highly trained infantry squads to move in, engaging with Russian forces along the way. The main advantage of the Ukrainians here is their far superior ground lines of communication, enjoying a direct supply line from Kramatorsk and Ruzhivka, functioning as central operating hubs for Ukrainian forces in northern Donetsk. Additionally, if we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that as the Ukrainian supply lines approach the front, they cross through several settlements in the valley between two hills. This blocks signals for Russian drones, who mainly rely on FPV-type kamikaze drones, instead of munitions dropped from drones. Russian fiber optics also still only makes up approximately 20% of FPVs used by the Russians, so the valley Ukrainians move through is largely protected against most Russian strikes. The buildings in the settlements and tree lines running along them offer additional concealment factors to Ukrainian infantry units passing through. The last major Ukrainian advantage is their extensive utilization of heavy drones like the Heavy Vampire and Baba Yaga variants. Because these drones drop heavy explosives or a series of smaller mortar rounds from a height, they are able to fly and hover above the valley, unaffected by the weaker signal strength that Russians suffer from lower to the ground. Geolocated footage shows how Ukrainian infantry squads move south through the settlements under the watchful eye and in constant communication with Mavic reconnaissance drones that detect any Russian presence. The Ukrainian squad initially engaged the position with grenade launchers using high explosive rounds. However, the rounds were not penetrating into the basement, where some of the Russians were hiding. So to save manpower, ammunition, and time, a Vampire hexacopter drone was called in. The drone then dropped 4 mortar rounds directly on the basement, wiping out the structure and scoring several direct hits into the underground structure itself. Russian infantry attempting to flank Ukrainian attacks from the high ground to the east are also promptly intercepted by Ukrainian FPV drones patrolling the area, as signal strengths are much less disrupted on the high ground and the slopes that the Russians must move across first. In this manner, Ukrainians are systematically moving south, having already consolidated full control of Volodymyrovka and expanding the gray zone to fully encompass the Russian salient. As you remember from a previous report, Ukrainians avoided finishing off the 2 Russian encirclements further north to lure more Russian forces in to attempt to rescue them, while keeping them away from important positions. However, with the trap now sprung, there is little reason to keep these pockets alive and the final clearing operations have begun. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground report that the western pocket has been cleared completely, as their attention is now moving to the one to the east. Every Russian is first offered surrender and to be taken as a prisoner of war. However, if they hold out and refuse, they are promptly dispatched, as Ukrainian forces are much needed elsewhere, and maintaining a tight perimeter costs a lot of resources. Ukrainians are closing the gates and finishing off any Russian soldiers who remain, as Ukrainian soldiers on the ground are already reporting that the prisoner of war exchange fund is rapidly being replenished. In the gray zone, Russian units moving through are now eliminated by drones, as Ukrainian infantry is making their way forward, leaving the fields covered in Russian bodies. Previously, Ukrainian drone warfare continues to evolve with remarkable accuracy and tactical finesse. In a recent operation on the southern front, FPV drone pilots from the Asgard unit of the Nemesis 412th Regiment successfully destroyed camouflaged Russian T-72 tank hidden in a forest strip. The strike showcased both the vulnerability of traditional armor and the precision of modern drone operators. Despite the tank being protected by anti-drone nets, metal grids, and reactive armor, the FPV team managed to bypass or penetrate these defenses. The T-72, a legacy platform heavily used by Russian forces, was reportedly turned into scrap in a direct hit, illustrating once again that even reinforced armored vehicles are no longer safe from skilled Ukrainian drone operators. The T-72 tank and its more modern counterpart, the T-80 unit, remain the backbone of Russia's armored fleet. Inheriting vast Soviet-era manufacturing capabilities, Russia has continued to modernize and produce these tanks at scale. However, the growing dominance of low-cost, high-precision FPV drones on the battlefield is increasingly calling into question the survivability of even the most heavily protected ground vehicles.